The decision to end Ivy's position at Forrester Creations did not come suddenly, nor did it arrive without hesitation. It was the result of mounting pressure, of accumulating consequences that had begun to outweigh any justification for keeping her within the company's inner circle. For Steffi and Ridge, it felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability, a necessary act to restore order in an environment that had been pushed to its limits. Yet what they underestimated, perhaps fatally, was the psychological terrain Ivy had already crossed long before that decision reached their desk. Because by the time the papers were prepared, by the time the signatures were ready to be placed, Ivy was no longer thinking in terms of preservation. She was thinking in terms of impact. She had seen the end coming, not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow tightening of options, a narrowing path that left her with fewer and fewer places to stand. Each conversation, each shift in tone, each glance that carried just a little less trust than before had confirmed what she already understood. There would be no redemption offered to her within these walls. No negotiation that would restore her position. No compromise that would allow her to remain without consequence. And for someone like Ivy, someone who had built her identity around the idea of control, of strategic movement, of always having a next step, the realization that she had reached a point with no return did not inspire surrender. It ignited something far more dangerous. What she could not keep, she would not allow to remain untouched. That thought did not arrive as anger alone, though anger was certainly present. It came as clarity, sharp and cold, cutting through the last remnants of hesitation. If she was going to be removed, if her contributions, her sacrifices, and her calculated risks were going to be erased with a signature, then she would ensure that her absence left a mark that could not be ignored. Not just a disruption, not just a temporary inconvenience, but something deeper, something that would embed itself into the company's memory long after she was gone. The plan did not form in a rush. It evolved, piece by piece, as Ivy moved through her final days within the company. She observed the systems, the routines, the patterns that govern the flow of information and control. She knew where access points existed, where vulnerabilities could be exploited without immediate detection. Her knowledge of the company's digital infrastructure was not superficial. It had been built over time, through involvement, through curiosity, through a quiet understanding that information was often the most powerful tool available to those who knew how to use it. Electra's upcoming collection became the focal point of her strategy, not because it was the most accessible target, but because it represented something larger than itself. It was a symbol of renewal, of the company's ability to move forward, to present something new and compelling to the world. It carried with it the promise of success, of stability, of a future that did not include Ivy. And in that promise, Ivy saw an opportunity not just to disrupt, but to redefine the narrative in a way that would force everyone involved to confront the consequences of what they had chosen. The execution of her plan required precision, patience, and a level of detachment that allowed her to move without hesitation. She waited for the right moment, the narrow window where access could be gained without raising suspicion. The system, built to support efficiency and collaboration, became her entry point, its strengths transformed into weaknesses under the right conditions. Files were located, structures analyzed, and with a calculated series of actions, the collection that had been months in the making was systematically erased. There was no immediate alarm, no flashing signal to indicate what had been lost. The deletion was clean, thorough, leaving behind only the absence of what had once been there. But Ivy did not stop at destruction. That alone would have been disruptive, certainly, but not defining. What she sought was something more personal, something that would resonate beyond the technical failure and into the emotional core of those involved. The replacement was where her intent revealed its true depth. The images she uploaded were not random, nor were they selected without purpose. They were moments captured in vulnerability, in secrecy, fragments of a connection between Electra and RJ that had never been meant for public view. They carried with them not just the suggestion of betrayal, but the undeniable evidence of it, framed in a way that left no room for interpretation. It was not just exposure. It was a narrative, one that Ivy constructed with the same precision she had applied to every other aspect of her plan. By the time the day of the show arrived, everything was in place. The venue was prepared, the audience assembled, the anticipation carefully built through weeks of promotion and expectation. This was meant to be a defining moment for Elektra, a presentation that would establish her presence within the industry, that would signal her transition from potential to reality. The atmosphere was charged with that expectation, a collective readiness to witness something new, something significant. Backstage, there was movement, coordination, the controlled chaos that accompanies any event of this scale. Final checks were conducted, adjustments made, everything aligned toward a single moment where preparation would give way to presentation. And at the center of it all stood Elektra, carrying not just the weight of her work, but the hope that this would mark the beginning of something meaningful. Will stood nearby, his presence steady, supportive, a reflection of the connection they had built through circumstances both complicated and profound. For him, this was more than a professional milestone. It was a validation of the path they had chosen, a moment where their future felt tangible, where the uncertainty that had once defined their relationship seemed to settle into something more stable. He watched her with a quiet pride, unaware of the fracture that was about to be introduced into that carefully constructed reality. When the show began, everything unfolded as expected, at least for a moment. The lights dimmed, the audience focused, the first signals of presentation aligning with a rhythm that had been rehearsed countless times. And then, without warning, the screen behind the stage shifted, not into the display of designs that had been meticulously prepared, but into something else entirely. At first, there was confusion, a delay, a technical error, something that could be corrected with a brief pause. But as the images stabilized, as their content became clear, the confusion gave way to something far more immediate. Schulp, the kind that does not require explanation, that bypasses thought and goes straight to reaction. Because what filled the screen was not fashion, not artistry, not the culmination of months of work. It was exposure, raw and undeniable, moments of intimacy that had no place in a setting defined by professionalism and expectation. Elektra saw it before she could fully process what it meant. The recognition was instantaneous, a visceral response that left her momentarily unable to move. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up, a wave of disbelief followed by a surge of realization that felt almost too overwhelming to contain. This was not an accident. It was not a mistake. It was intentional, precise, and devastating in its execution. The audience reacted in fragments, whispers turning into murmurs, murmurs into a collective disturbance that spread through the room with increasing intensity. Cameras shifted, not toward the stage, but toward the screen, toward the unfolding scandal that had replaced the expected spectacle. The narrative changed in an instant, from admiration to scrutiny, from anticipation to judgment. And in that shift, everything that had been built began to collapse. Will's reaction was immediate, though not fully controlled. He stepped forward instinctively, as though proximity could somehow contain what was happening. But there was nothing to contain. The images were already public, already captured, already spreading beyond the confines of the room into a world that would consume them without hesitation. The humiliation he felt was not just personal. It was amplified by the context, by the presence of those who now witnessed something that should have remained private. For Elektra, the impact was deeper, more complex. This was not just embarrassment. It was a dismantling of identity, a moment where her professional and personal lives collided in a way that left no separation between them. The work she had done, the effort she had invested, the vision she had hoped to share, all of it was overshadowed by something she had never intended to define her. And in that overshadowing, there was a loss that extended beyond the immediate moment, into the future she had imagined. Backstage, chaos erupted, not in loud confrontation, but in frantic attempts to regain control, to shut down the feed, to restore something that had already been lost. But control, once broken in this way, does not return easily. The damage was not just technical. It was narrative, emotional, reputational. It existed in every reaction, every glance, every captured moment that would continue to circulate long after the event ended. And somewhere beyond that immediate chaos, Ivy stood apart, not physically present, but undeniably connected to everything that was unfolding. Her plan had succeeded, not just in disruption, but in transformation. The story had changed, the focus redirected, the consequences set in motion in ways that could not be undone. But even in that success, there was a complexity she could not entirely control. Because while she had orchestrated the moment, she could not dictate how it would continue to evolve, how the people involved would respond, how the ripple effects would extend beyond what she had anticipated. For Will and Elektra, the aftermath was not immediate resolution, but a silence filled with questions that could not be easily answered. Trust, once fractured in such a public and painful way, does not repair itself through explanation alone. It requires time, understanding, and a willingness to confront not just what was revealed, but what it meant. And for Forrester Creations, the event marked not just a failed presentation, but a shift in perception, a reminder that vulnerability exists even within the most controlled environments, and that the consequences of underestimating someone with nothing left to lose can extend far beyond what anyone is prepared to handle. There are moments when generosity disguises itself so convincingly that even the people closest to it fail to recognize the quiet danger hidden beneath its surface. When Melissa first made the offer, it did not sound like a disruption waiting to unfold. It sounded like compassion, pure and selfless, an act of emotional courage in response to a grief that had already begun to hollow out Daphne from within. The pain of not being able to have a child had settled deeply into Daphne's life, not as something dramatic or visible, but as a constant, quiet absence that touched every moment of her existence. It was present in the way she lingered around other people's children, in the way her voice softened when she spoke about the future, in the way hope had gradually transformed into something fragile, something she no longer allowed herself to hold too tightly. Carter saw that pain in ways that were both immediate and complicated. As her husband, he felt the weight of it not just as an observer, but as someone who shared in the loss, even if his experience of it was different. He wanted to fix it, to find a solution that would restore what had been taken from them, but he also understood that some things could not be repaired through effort alone. The limits of his ability to help created a tension within him, a quiet frustration that he carried without expressing fully, because to voice it would only deepen Daphne's sense of failure, something he refused to allow. So when Melissa stepped forward with her offer, it arrived in a moment where vulnerability had already softened resistance. She did not present it as sacrifice, did not frame it as something extraordinary. Instead, she spoke with a calm sincerity that made the idea feel almost natural, as though it had always been a possibility waiting to be acknowledged. She positioned herself not as someone intervening, but as someone extending a bridge, offering a path forward where none had seemed possible before. Daphne's initial reaction was instinctive and immediate. She rejected the idea not because she did not understand it, but because she understood it too well. The implications were too vast, too personal, too deeply tied to questions she had not yet resolved within herself. Allowing another woman to carry her child was not just a medical decision. It was an emotional surrender, a redefinition of motherhood that forced her to confront her own limitations in a way she was not prepared to accept. There was also something else beneath that resistance, something quieter but just as powerful, the awareness of who Melissa was and what her presence in their lives could mean if boundaries were not carefully maintained. But resistance, when confronted with longing, rarely remains absolute. Over time, as the reality of her situation continued to press against her, As the absence she felt grew harder to ignore, Daphne began to reconsider. It was not a sudden change, not a moment of clarity that resolved all her doubts. It was a gradual shift, driven by the simple, undeniable desire to hold a child she could call her own. That desire did not erase her fears. It made her willing to carry them. Carter, caught between his wife's pain and the complexity of Melissa's offer, found himself navigating a space where every decision felt weighted with consequence. He trusted Melissa, at least in the way one trusts someone who has proven themselves capable of understanding emotional nuance. But trust, in this context, was not simple. It required him to believe not only in her intentions, but in his own ability to maintain the boundaries that would keep their lives from becoming entangled in ways that could not be easily undone. The agreement, when it was finally reached, felt less like resolution and more like a fragile alignment of needs, desires, and unspoken concerns. Each of them entered into it with a different expectation, a different understanding of what it would mean. For Daphne, it was a chance, perhaps her only chance, to become a mother. For Carter, it was a solution to a problem he had not been able to solve on his own. And for Melissa, though she framed it as an act of kindness, it carried with it something deeper, something she had not fully examined, or perhaps something she had chosen not to acknowledge. The pregnancy did not transform their lives immediately. It unfolded in stages marked by medical appointments, careful monitoring, the slow, steady progression of something that was both deeply personal and clinically managed. At first, the boundaries held. Interactions were measured, emotions contained, the structure of the arrangement providing a framework that kept everything in place. But as time passed, as the reality of the pregnancy became more tangible, those boundaries began to shift, not through deliberate action, but through the quiet accumulation of moments that carried more weight than anyone had anticipated. Melissa experienced the change first, though she did not immediately understand it. Carrying the child was not just a physical experience. It was an emotional one that connected her to something she had not expected to feel so intensely. Each movement, each change in her body, reinforced a connection that went beyond the agreement she had entered into. It was not ownership she felt, not a desire to claim what was not hers. It was something more complicated, a sense of attachment that existed alongside her understanding of the role she had agreed to play. Carter, in his own way, was affected by that shift. His interactions with Melissa, once defined by gratitude and distance, began to take on a different tone. He found himself more attentive, more present, more aware of her in ways that extended beyond the immediate context of the pregnancy. It was not something he encouraged consciously. It was something that emerged, subtle and unintentional, shaped by proximity, by shared experience, by the simple reality of what they were creating together, even if that creation was meant for someone else. Daphne saw it, not all at once, but in fragments. A glance that lingered slightly too long. A conversation that carried an undercurrent she could not quite define. A shift in energy that made her feel as though something was changing in ways she could not control. At first, she dismissed it, telling herself that it was natural, that the situation itself was complex enough to create moments of ambiguity. But the more she observed, the harder it became to ignore. Her fear did not manifest as anger immediately. It began as unease, a quiet discomfort that followed her through her days, that settled into her thoughts when she tried to rest. She had agreed to this, she reminded herself. She had chosen this path, had accepted the risks that came with it. But knowing that did not make the feeling disappear. If anything, it made it more difficult to confront, because it forced her to question her own judgment, her own willingness to allow something so intimate to be shared in a way she could not fully control. Will, standing outside this arrangement, but deeply connected to Melissa, reacted differently. His response was not quiet or measured. It was immediate, visceral, driven by a jealousy that he could neither suppress nor fully rationalize. Watching Melissa carry another man's child, watching her become integrated into a family that was not his, triggered a fear that went beyond insecurity. It was a fear of displacement, of losing her in a way that could not be reversed. He saw the way Carter looked at her, the way their interactions had begun to shift, and he interpreted it not as complexity, but as threat. To him, the situation was not balanced, not controlled. It was a slow progression towards something he did not want to acknowledge, a bond forming that had the potential to outlast the pregnancy itself. And that possibility unsettled him in ways that made restraint impossible. His attempt to address it did not bring clarity. They brought conflict. Melissa, caught between her commitment to Daphne and Carter and her connection to Will, found herself navigating an emotional landscape that was becoming increasingly unstable. She could not deny what she was feeling, not entirely, but she also could not allow those feelings to dictate her actions. The promise she had made, the role she had accepted, carried a responsibility that extended beyond her own emotional state. Daphne, watching all of this unfold, felt the ground beneath her shifting in ways she had not anticipated. What had once been a solution now felt like a risk, a decision that had introduced variables she could not control. The child she longed for, the future she had imagined, now seemed entangled with dynamics that threatened to reshape her marriage in ways she could not predict. And in that uncertainty, her fear deepened, transforming from unease into something more defined, something closer to dread. The love triangle that emerged was not dramatic in its expression, not marked by overt declarations or clear boundaries. It was subtle, complex, defined by what was felt rather than what was said. Each of them occupied a space within it that was shaped by their own needs, their own fears, their own understanding of what was at stake. And within that space, the lines between intention and consequence blurred, creating a tension that could not be easily resolved. For Daphne, the question that lingered was not just whether she would become a mother, but what she might lose in the process. For Carter, it was whether he could maintain the balance he believed he had control over, or whether the situation would evolve beyond his ability to manage it. For Melissa, it was whether she could carry not just the child, but the emotional weight of what that role demanded, without allowing it to redefine who she was and where she belonged. And for Will, it was whether love, once threatened by forces beyond his control, could survive in a space where trust had begun to fracture, where fear had taken root, and where the future he had imagined no longer felt secure. The pregnancy, meant to bring life and hope, had instead created a landscape of uncertainty, one where every step forward carried the potential for loss. And as time moved on, as the child within Melissa grew, so too did the tension that surrounded them, shaping their relationships in ways none of them had fully anticipated when the offer was first made. Because sometimes the most well-intentioned decisions do not lead to resolution. Sometimes they reveal the complexities that were already present, bringing them to the surface in ways that cannot be ignored, and forcing everyone involved to confront not just what they want,